One of the huge takeaways from LifeTour is that pro-life Canadians are beginning to understand that it's not enough to sit inside our churches, to sit inside our living rooms and say we're pro-life. We're beginning to understand that if we're going to make a difference, we have to be pro-life. And that involves getting out there and making a difference, having conversations with your neighbors, with your coworkers, etc. And we're giving them the tools to do that, and they're excited to take those tools and get to work.
On the feature this week, a recap of LifeTour, some of the experiences, the lessons learned, and a look at applying this kind of model to future ARPA endeavors. In the news, ARPA made a presentation to a parliamentary panel on euthanasia last week. We talked to the leader of the Christian Heritage Party about how they did in the federal election earlier this month, and a new video from the Cornwall Alliance on a Christian approach to climate change.
And now, Lighthouse News. Lighthouse News is a presentation of ARPA, the Association for Reform Political Action. Here's your host, Al Sebring.
Well, the election is done and some of the routine work is starting up in Ottawa again. The outgoing government had appointed a select panel to give Parliament some advice on what to do about the so-called Carter decision earlier this year. That's the Supreme Court ruling that struck down the Criminal Code's ban on doctor-assisted suicide. That panel held some hearings last week. ARPA made a presentation last Thursday. Legal counsel Andre Schuten.
We made 3 submissions to the panel. The first was because of the inherent risk and danger in legalizing assisted suicide euthanasia, we urged the panel to present as one option of various. They're going to be presenting options from other groups as well. So we urge them that at least one of those options that they present to Parliament should include either the notwithstanding clause as a legislative option or the option that John Sikma outlined on this program a couple weeks ago and which was in his National Post editorial, that being that if we simply pass a new law that changes or explains fully the object or the purpose of a total ban on euthanasia, we can actually institute again a total ban on euthanasia in the Criminal Code without having to even bother enacting or referring to Section 33, which is the notwithstanding clause.
The third option, Schuten says, takes into account the new political reality on the government benches in Ottawa.
The Liberal Party, it's part of its platform, has definitely been open to the idea of legalizing assisted suicide and euthanasia. So if this government does not want to do what we think is the right thing to do, which is a total ban, if instead they want to go down this road of legalizing or opening up the door to assisted suicide, then we urged on them a number of various restrictions on the procedure in order to mitigate the harm as much as is possible.
Parliament has till next February to rewrite the law. And another bit of retrospection on the election campaign this week from the leader of the Christian Heritage Party. It may not seem like it, but the CHP's been around for almost 30 years now. They still haven't managed any electoral success, but they're not letting that get them down. Leader Rod Taylor says in the most recent election, they fielded 30 candidates across the country. Generally, support was up fractionally, most of the candidates finishing just under 1% of the vote in each of their ridings. And he says, in spite of not electing anybody, he's not unhappy with the way the campaign went.
Considering the red tide we've all just endured, I'm pleased with some of the gains that we made. We didn't have any dramatic spikes. I think our highest percent for a candidate, Jerome Dondo, in Port Lisgar, Manitoba, got 3.2%.
As to the next 4 years, Taylor says there will definitely be a need for the CHP to continue to deliver its message.
Unless there's a dramatic reversal, Mr. Trudeau has, which we would hope and pray for, some kind of revelation that there's more to life than power politics. I think social conservatives could be in for a rough ride. If he exercises the power that he now has in a sectarian way, there's no evidence that isn't going to happen. I think social conservatives could have a difficult time over the next while. So we'll need to be faithful and continue to speak the truth in love.
He says the biggest frustration of the campaign was the lack of attention his party received from the major media outlets, particularly the CBC. And the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation is out with a new documentary on climate change. It's called Where the Grass is Greener, Biblical Stewardship versus Climate Alarmism. Director Cal Beisner says the documentary interacts with a whole range of people to make the case for a responsible approach to the issue.
The whole climate change controversy and everything about climate policy and everything else, these are probably the most multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary sets of problems that I've ever seen. My own undergraduate training was in interdisciplinary studies at the University of Southern California. The key to that is not just simply that you study several different disciplines, enough to know hardly anything worth knowing about any one of them, but rather that you learn to use the principles, the tools, and the methods of several disciplines harmoniously to address a multifaceted problem. And so ever since then, that's what I've sought to do. So this was an opportunity for me to bring all of these different ideas together in one documentary.
If you're interested in more on this new film, we've got a link up from the Lighthouse News homepage. Back with more after this.
Do you have a message to share with the world? ARPA's Billboard contest deadline has been extended to November 21st. We are looking for new designs that can be turned into large-scale ads to be placed across the country. Billboards, transit shelters, and bus benches are just some of the places we have seen previous designs. There are two categories. The first is abortion, and the second is all other political issues. Check out arpacanada.ca/contest2015 for submission guidelines and prizes.
And we're back on the program. With everything that's happened in the past week, including the election of a new government, it's easy to forget about a major project that ARPA engaged in earlier this month, LifeTour. It's been just over a week since the tour wrapped up with its final stop in Vancouver, and on the line with me today is Mike Schutten, the director of We Need a Law. That's ARPA's expressly pro-life arm. Mike, I want to take a few minutes today to look back on the tour, some of the highs and the lows and general impressions. I know that, among other things, you got to drive right across the country. That had to be pretty neat, but beyond that, recap the tour for me a little bit.
It was a really awesome experience. Like you said, just to see our country and how vast and beautiful it is was a bonus of traveling it with a message pertaining to preborn human rights. We had 8 interns along with us. That really made it professional. It also made it fun. We had a lot of good times together, but in the same breath, we also were able to see just how serious this is. And these young people who have a ton of energy and passion, for many of them, it was their first experience in advocating out there on the streets for the rights of their preborn neighbors, and they took it seriously. You know, like I said, we had good times, a lot of laughs shared, etc., many memories made, but to see them so focused on advocating for their preborn neighbors was really quite a blessing for us as staff who were along, because that's essentially how we're going to build that momentum, by getting young people engaged and getting them to understand that, you know what, there are careers out there that could afford them a lot more money than working in the pro-life movement, but there's a few of them who seriously are considering, making this part of their career so that they can help us make a difference in our country.
You talk about memories made. Talk to me about some of those memories that were made for you.
I think some of the most memorable times were when we were in venues that were not the traditional, Reformed venue in a church setting. So we had several presentations in university settings, for example, University of Western Ontario in London, University of Toronto, University of Ottawa. And at these events, the majority of the participants, the guests that we were able to welcome, were university students, people just from the streets who had been invited by university students, and they came in just questioning, kind of wondering what this was all about, why would people be crossing the country with this message during the election, and they went away educated, they went away sometimes motivated to help make change. So that was very, very encouraging for us. In fact, in the University of Ottawa, there was one woman who came in and she had many questions, especially in regards to what about in the cases of rape and these really hard question cases? And she said to one of our staff at the end, she said, I came in here pro-choice and I am leaving pro-life. So that was really unique for us as a staff to experience that, in contrast to the many venues that we did host events in where the Reformed Church community came out. These were people who were already pro-life, but they left just buying up lawn signs and window decals and t-shirts, so they got engaged. And I think that speaks to one of the huge takeaways from LifeTour is that pro-life Canadians are beginning to understand that it's not enough to sit inside our churches, to sit inside our living rooms and say we're pro-life. We're beginning to understand that if we're going to make a difference, we have to be pro-life. And that involves getting out there and making a difference, having conversations with your neighbors, with your coworkers, etc. And we're giving them the tools to do that, and they're excited to take those tools and get to work.
You talk about making a difference, and the timing of this tour was deliberately set to overlap with the last 3 weeks or whatever of the federal campaign. How much of a difference did we make in the tone and tenor of the federal campaign? I sort of asked you this question when we did the feature, the roundtable on the post-election analysis, but we've got a little more time here. Talk to me a little bit about, for lack of a better word, the politics of this.
For the immediate, during this federal election campaign, I think we cannot look back and say, oh, we turned the tide of this, or because of the work we did, this candidate here got in, whereas they wouldn't have got in if we wouldn't have done that work. So that did not play out, and in fact, that wasn't really the mission of LifeTour. We initiated LifeTour during the election campaign because of the reality that during an election campaign, most Canadians are engaged more so than they normally would be on issues of the day. And we wanted to make sure that we could do everything we could to inject this narrative into the existing narrative of the election campaign. And we saw that happen, not on a large scale insofar as, the national media were covering us, etc., although we got a lot of media hits, and in fact, the National Post even published one of our articles during LifeTour. But we saw Canadians, specifically pro-life Canadians, begin to understand that if we're going to make a difference, we have to speak to Canadians where they're at. So, for example, that's why we focused on sex-selective abortion, late-term abortion, preborn victims of crime. And pro-life Canadians are beginning to realize that if we're going to make a difference, we have to work with more than just pro-life Canadians. We have an excellent example of that at the University of Ottawa, where one of the questions that was asked of me was from a woman who identified as trans. So this was a trans woman, a man, not exactly sure how we describe this, but she stood up and said, I'm in the trans community, and I believe that preborn human rights are not being respected, not being protected in our country. She asked of me, can you explain how your organization views people in the trans community and whether or not you're willing to work along with us? So I was able to explain to her how WeNeedALaw.ca is very focused, and that is simply to build support for preborn human rights to be protected. And because we're so focused on that, and we're not out there advocating for families and traditional families and all this other thing, we are able to work with many different groups. And I gave her examples of how we did so during the debate on Motion 408, Mark Morowa's motion concerning sex-selective abortion, how we were able to work with feminist groups that, on every other moral and ethical issue, we probably would not see eye to eye, but on this one, we did. And therefore, we didn't let what set us apart become our focus, but we let what we had in common be our focus, and we could work together. I was somewhat nervous about how I answered that question, knowing that there were pastors and elders in the audience as well. I asked several of them afterwards, and they appreciated the fact that in that public setting, we're not going to focus on our differences, but when it comes to preborn human rights and we can agree, then we can work together and move forward.
Having done the tour this way with the 8 interns and all the rest of it, this is the first time we've done it this way. Looking ahead, are we going to do this kind of thing again, this model of a tour with more participation than, if I can put it this way, just the usual suspects, the 2 or 3 guys from ARPA that go on the road?
There's huge merit in conducting something like this again. We can't guarantee right now we're going to be able to do that. Obviously, that's up to the ARPA board and us as staff as we plan for 2016. What I can say is that the experience with the interns was incredibly beneficial for our organization. We saw that if we are going to make progress, we're going to have to involve those young people. We're going to have to get them interested in this mission that we're trying to accomplish of building a groundswell of support. And in order to do that, we're going to have to find ways to get more and more of them involved. Because each one of them that left LifeTour is now going to affect 5 to 10 other people with their stories and their experiences, and get 5 to 10 other people thinking about how, hey, if they ever do this again, I want to do it. In fact, many of the interns left saying, look, if there's ever an opportunity to do this again, please let me know. And these are people that, for example, Tricia, one of our interns, has a full-time job as an RN in Ontario. Like, she has a good job, but she's willing to set time aside in order to do this. Stan, our token male intern, he said, you know what, I have a good job, I have a career awaiting me in my family business, but if there's an opportunity that comes up again, let me know, because I want to make sure that I'm going to be a part of that. So that bodes very well for carrying out our mission, and we're very optimistic that even with a Liberal majority government, we can make big strides and differences in the next 4 years.
Mike, we're out of time. Thank you.
Thanks, Al.
This has been Lighthouse News, delivering news and commentaries on today's current events to equip Christians for their task in the public square. Production Manager Brian Grimm. Technical Director Nate Bosher. Questions or feedback? You can leave us an audio comment by clicking on the answering machine button at the top of the Lighthouse News homepage, or you can send us an email, info@arpacanada.ca. Be sure to join us again next week for another edition of Lighthouse News.